Hi everyone, this is our last unit for the year, Unit 5, last one, Notes 1, Darwin and Evidence for Evolution. This is where we start to get into topics where some people will not necessarily agree, and it's okay if you don't agree. We still have to teach you this material. We're looking at science only, so we're looking at what we have evidence and data for, and that's a key thing to remember here throughout this whole unit. When we are finished with this unit, we then move into dissections and then finals, and that's it. So just keep all of that in mind. There is a goal here, and we're going to get that goal and then make our way to those dissections and hopefully have a great summer ahead of us. All right, let's get started with this then. This first set of notes is just kind of giving you a little bit of background information and some basic terms that people don't necessarily always use correctly. So we're going to clarify what all of these words mean. First things first, the word evolution. Evolution is really just change over long periods of time. And by long periods of time, we're talking not tens or hundreds or even thousands of years. We're looking at many thousands and millions of years. That much time is how much we're talking about when we're talking about that change. Sometimes it's also referred to as descent with modification. So if we're modifying things, again, that's just another word for change, and descent, meaning we're descending from or moving forward or passing on our information over that time, or genetic information over that time with some modifications. Again, lots and lots and lots of time has to pass. The theory that modern organisms, today's organisms, have descended from ancestral organisms is also part of evolution, which makes sense. We're talking about how the genetic information continues to pass on year after year, generation after generation. And what we're looking at there is just that as that genetic information gets passed along, how does it change? Evolution is based upon well-supported, testable. If it's not testable, we're not worrying about it. So testable explanations of phenomena that have occurred in the natural world. So this has to do with nature taking course, not necessarily technology or science interfering, just what would happen, what could we test that is occurring in the natural world on its own, already happening. Some evidences for all of this evolution. Let's start with the fossil record. The fossil record is great at being able to show us, like if we look over here, this is an example of it, different fossils, when they were around and for how long, and then when did they maybe start to disappear from that record. So with the fossil record, any fossils that are found lower in lower layers, they have been around the longest. And if we see that fossil has been around in multiple layers, then we know that it has been around for a long time. And then if it all of a sudden disappears in these higher layers of our rock history, then we're not going to see that organism around anymore. Or did it possibly disappear maybe and then come back and now it's modified a little bit, or anything along those lines? But we look at the fossil record, and that's a huge piece of evidence for how things have changed over time. With this particular type of species, you can tell that it started out like this. Over time, it's kind of, now it's longer, and maybe it got longer because it needed to reach food in a different spot. So it had to change or modify or evolve over time and get longer. But the This part here and this part here look fairly similar. And then over time, we still have that similarity here, but now it's more of a round shape to it. And so maybe that had to do with, again, it could have been food, it could have been a defense mechanism, it could have been a lot of different things. And then same thing here where it's bigger even and more round and curled in, but we still have this same feature in all 4 of those shells. So that could be something that could give us a hint as to how and when and why a species changed over time. We also have geographic distribution of living species. So when we look at a map, and I know that this map is a little bit hard, I'm gonna try to zoom in a little bit here. Move my paper a little, there we go. So when we look at this map of the capybara, the muskrat, I cannot even read what that one says. Let me zoom in a little bit more here. What does that say? I can't see what it says. Koipu, this one got a little cut off too. But if we look at all of these different, I apologize for the copying of these, you guys. If we look at these different species here, the geographic distribution of where they are gives us an idea of where the populations are bigger. Is it because of a food? Is it because of mating? Is it because of a predator not being present? And then we look at distribution patterns of where they've migrated to, and we've talked a little bit about this in the last unit, but where are they migrating to? How is the species changing? Are there features that are best suited for the geographical area that they're living in compared to where they came from? All kinds of stuff like that. But this helps us to understand that when this happens, we will see that there are unrelated organisms that appear very similar as a result of similar selective pressures. So even though they may not be necessarily related, they're very similar looking. It could be because of a different geographic, maybe changes that have happened. Maybe it's becoming warmer and drier, so they've had to adapt for those conditions. Maybe it is because of, again, different food sources, so then they may have to adapt maybe their paws or their facial features to be able to get food, something along those lines. And if they are related to each other, then how is it that they're changing because of those geographic changes as well? So those are things to look at when we look at geographic distribution of living species. The next thing that we are going to take a look at are, and this is a really big line, but it's not necessary. I apologize for that one too. Homologous structures. Homologous structures are the structures that have been seen in different types of organisms, and they are different mature forms and uses, or they all have different mature forms and uses, but they develop from the same embryonic tissues. And this is really interesting. I believe there's a picture in your textbook, if you guys get a chance to go look at it, that shows you the different colors of the bones and how the similar bones in different animals, I mean, human, cat, whale, bat, how the similar bones, they're all the same color, but where they appear for all of these different species. And you can see that all of them have the exact same bones. They all develop from the same embryonic tissue, but when they're mature, a human arm is gonna definitely look different from a cat and a whale and a bat arm or whale fin. And so when that happens, it gives us evidence that because they all have the same types of bones, basically in the same arrangement or the same order, they just have develop differently over time because of the needs for those species and their living conditions. So homologous structures, there's lots of them between a lot of different species. Those are really good evidence that evolution or change over a very long period of time has occurred. And then our last one, we're gonna say our DNA and amino acid sequences. With this one, this is a good piece of evidence because it helps evolutionary biologists to be able to construct or put together what we call a phylogenetic tree. And we'll practice with these phylogenetic trees because they can be a little confusing at times. This is an example of a phylogenetic tree here, but it presents their best hypothesis about how a set of species evolved from a common ancestor. Present-day species are found at the tips, so way over here on the end. And the branch points mark the two species' most recent common ancestor. So here would have been a common ancestor, and then here's a branch point right here where it branches off to two different species. And then you can see that when we branched off here, that was its own species, but then when we branched off here, we did even more branching. So now this branches to a different species, and this one branches to a different species, and then this one will branch to two different, this one branches to two more different. So these are our species of interest. They are the most common ones because they're at the ends or the tip of the phylogenetic tree. And then at the branching points here, this is a branching point, that's a branching point. That's where we divide off and become, something causes those species to change, to need to change, and then those changes are so significant that they become their own species, but they were related to this common ancestor at these branches before they became their own species. So that's how we'll read the phylogenetic tree. We're gonna take a look and practice with some of those in this unit, just so you guys understand how to read them and how to use them, because you will see those questions on your test. Okay, now let's go and take a look at our driving force for how we knew about evolution in the first place. And this is all due to Charles Darwin. Charles Darwin, when he was 22 years old, he was asked to join a bunch of people on the HMS Beagle and sail around the world for a few years and just explore the natural world. So they wanted to study and observe what was out there in other countries, other lands that had not really been explored yet. During his voyage on the HMS Beagle, he spent most of his time collecting thousands and thousands of specimens. Anything from plants to insects to animals, birds, rodents, butterflies, whatever he could find, he would try to collect it. And then he also tried to collect any fossils that he could find. Living plants and animals. So he was collecting lots of different organisms just to study them. He wanted to see what was there, because where he was coming from in England, he really didn't have anything other than what was there that he knew about. And so every time he traveled to a new place, he saw something new and he wanted to learn more about those new organisms. You can see here's the map here of where they left and then the direction that they traveled. So they kind of came down first. They did their trip over here. Well, actually they came down and then they went back up and then around and around and around and around. Here's the Galapagos. They went down and then back up and finally made their way back to England. They stopped and spent a lot of time here in the Galapagos Islands. So if you see on the map here, we're pretty much on the equator, right on the equator, and that's going to be a big focal point for his studies. He also spent a lot of time, this is a continuation from the front, a lot of time observing and taking a lot of notes that he later had transcribed into notebooks, and they actually ended up making a big book out of the writings that he did. He did notice, this is gonna get zoomed out a little bit again. He did notice a huge diversity of plants and animals, and he also noticed a lot of similarities between geographic regions and their life. And whenever he traveled to somewhere new, each geographic region had its own special circumstances, its own special climate, geographical features, animals and plants and everything else, other living organisms, and also their own fossils that looked very similar to modern organisms. So they had a lot of similarities, but then some were also very different, possibly giving some inclination that there were some extinctions along the way. So if he hadn't seen those species in modern times, and those fossils didn't really look familiar, then it was probably safe to start looking in the direction and thinking in the direction that that was possibly an extinction that occurred, or there was an extinction that occurred for that animal. Okay, let's go back to those Galapagos Islands I was talking about. So he stopped there. There were 13 major islands that he kind of hopped on. So he would go from one island to the next wherever he could. There were a lot of smaller ones as well, but he kind of focused on these 13 major islands. And it was discovered that they were formed from many volcanic eruptions. So all of these islands were a result of volcanic activity, volcanic eruptions, bringing that land up to the surface from underneath the ocean. The islands are incredibly unique because they do surround the equator. Now, most of the time when we think of equator, we think of really hot climate, but there's actually a good mix of tropical and temperate climates. So they're not all the same. And because of that difference between either a tropical climate or a temperate climate, that also meant that he was going to see a lot of different species living there as well on each island. And those islands have been extremely isolated, or had been extremely isolated for many years. They still are today. There are places where people are not supposed to go. They are hands off. They cannot go to those parts of those islands, certain parts. And then some parts are very minimally inhabited. So that's why people can't go to the Galapagos Islands and visit them and explore them too. Many of the species that Darwin found are endemic. This means that you can't find them anywhere else in the world. They're only going to be found right there in the Galapagos Islands. This included the giant Galapagos tortoise. I had a student that actually went to the Galapagos Islands, I think it was 2 or 3 years ago. He's a junior now, and I think he went his freshman year. So 2 or 3 years ago, and he told me that those giant Galapagos tortoises really are huge. You guys are going to see in one of your assignments that we're looking at how big they are, and they were big enough that people could ride on them. You're not supposed to now, but Darwin would ride on the tortoises because they were big enough for him to be able to do that. And they do live for a long time, so they can have plenty of time to get pretty big, and all of that good stuff. Marine iguanas, he saw lots of those, and they are not found anywhere else. It's a different type of iguana than you're going to find anywhere else in the world. the flightless cormorant, and then the Galapagos penguin, which penguins you don't typically tend to see on the equator, but the Galapagos penguin does exist there. So again, endemic means that they are found nowhere else in the world, just there in the Galapagos Islands. He also noticed that the island finches, which is a bird, they all had different types of beaks, and they varied from island to island, and it really just kind of depended on their conditions that they were living in. Again, some geographic stuff, mostly food though. So the finches were a huge topic of study. When you hear Darwin, typically you hear, or people will talk about the finches that he studied in the Galapagos Islands. Some of those beaks that the finches had very thick beaks, so that was so that they could crack through really hard shells for a food source, or really big shell for a food source. Some of them had very long skinny beaks, maybe because they needed to be able to get into a flower that had its nectar a lot deeper, or maybe it needed to be able to reach an insect that was inside of a really hard to get place. So their beaks had to change over time, evolve, modify over time. And that was so that they could reach their food source, so that they could continue to eat, which means that they could continue to live, which means that they could continue to pass on their genetic information from one generation to the next, which again is the whole point of this. So lots of differences that he saw there on this voyage. He did keep some of these species and brought them back to England with him. He would do a lot of sketches, a lot of different things to keep note of everything that was different about all the species he encountered. And then this was put into a giant book that he wrote called On the Origin of Species, which I have a copy of it. If anybody ever wants to take a look at it, you are welcome to. But it's a big book about all of the things that he discovered on this 5-year voyage on the HMS Beagle. So what did he bring back with him besides bugs and plants and all kinds of other things? Well, the first thing was this whole insight that there was variation among individuals in a population. So you can have the same species of an organism, and there would be some variation among those individuals within a certain population. And that was perfectly normal to see. We see that today. We know that there's variation in individuals within a population even now with a lot of the species that we're familiar with. The variations are heritable. And that's just because when we pass down those genes, we know that certain genes are going to code for certain things. And if it's a dominant or a recessive allele, then that depends, or that will impact what we see for our phenotype. And we've learned all of this stuff, but now we're starting to see it come to light. And back during Darwin's time, this stuff wasn't really known. We still didn't know what DNA was. We didn't know what the shape was. That came a lot later. More than 100 years after that voyage that he took. So he was still just understanding that I see this change in one species, and I'm continuing to see it over these different organisms, or throughout this particular organism, and that change is continuing on, so it must be something that could be helpful. Populations are going to have more offspring than can survive due to resource competition. And so when we have a lot of the same species, there are a lot of offspring, like what we talked about with those dandelions. When you blow on one of those dandelions and the seeds are going everywhere, and they're just going to land on the ground and start to repopulate, and it doesn't matter how many of them repopulate, there's going to be enough to keep that population going. Well, it's kind of like that, where a lot of species will do that. They'll populate and have more offspring than they know are going to survive, but the ones that do survive generally have really favorable traits. So those with favorable traits are going to be selected, meaning that those genes are going to become more of a dominant gene or become more frequently seen within those species and within their genetic code when it gets passed on from one generation to the next. A couple of other little vocab words that you guys need to know to help you out with this particular unit. The word fitness is not talking about how buff you get when you go to the gym and how much you can bench and how much you're squatting. We're not talking about that kind of fitness. What we're talking about is the ability of an organism to survive and reproduce in its specific environment. So when a species has a higher fitness, it's because they have these favorable traits that have changed over time to the point where now they are able to survive better in their environment. And because they're able to survive better in their environment, they can be picked by a mate and then reproduce with them and continue to pass on their genetic information. The other word that we need to know is adaptation. And an adaptation is any inherited characteristic that increases an organism's chance of survival. And that could be some sort of an anatomical or structural change, something where they physically change to be able to maybe blend in with their environment so that a predator doesn't find them. It could be a physiological process, how well they are able to possibly digest a certain food so that they can continue to eat that food because that's what's abundant and what's available so that they can survive. Or it could be a behavior. It could be maybe a mating behavior. Maybe they change something that they do to attract a mate, and then that helps them to be able to reproduce and pass on their genetic information. So it could be a lot of different ways. So adaptations are inherited characteristics that increase your chance of survival, which kind of leads us to the survival of the fittest concept that people hear about. Survival of the fittest is really the same thing as natural selection. Now, if you guys like to do flashcards to help yourself study for tests, this is a great unit for that because there are a lot of vocab words: fitness, adaptation, natural selection, survival of the fittest, same thing. All of those are great to be able to put into flashcards. But survival of the fittest, natural selection, this is this idea that Darwin proposed that there should be a space in here. Over long periods of time, lots and lots of generations, natural selection, that's what NS stands for. Natural selection produces organisms with different structures, establishing different niches, however you want to say it, niches, or occupy different habitats. And as a result, the species today look different than their ancestors or the ones that we observe in the fossil records. So natural selection is essentially this proposal that over a very long period of time, species are going to change their structures. They're going to have different niches or jobs within their community and occupy different habitats, move to different places so that they can continue to survive and pass on their genetic information. And because of those changes that they made, whether they be structural or behavioral or geographical, they are going to look different from their ancestors before, which makes sense because if you want to keep surviving, you're going to keep making these changes so that you can keep moving on and passing on your genetic information from one generation to the next. Okay, that's all I got for you.